Good morning, everyone. I am Jessie Whittish with Kentucky Youth Advocates. It's great to see all of you here this morning. So we're excited to have this roundtable discussion with some of our partners from across the Commonwealth, across the political spectrum, across experience. So before we hear from them, just a reminder that we are recording today's forum as both a video and a podcast. So we ask that you stay muted, but we also encourage you to drop questions or comments or anything like that in the chat. And panelists, if you're up for looking at that, you can, but we'll try to get to those questions. And if we can't get to them today, we will follow up with you about that info. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Terry Brooks.
Hey, thanks, Jessie. And I believe, almost always open these by saying, I think this is like our 114th partner forum. And so whether you have been to 114 or this is your very first one, we are so glad to have you. And we also, as always, want to acknowledge that this would not be possible without the support of Aetna Healthcare, and we appreciate that support to be able to bring folks together. We also need to do a shout out for so many of y'all who joined us last week for Children's Advocacy Week. Just a week ago, this very moment, that we had our virtual rally, and I love the fact, I hope you love the fact that that was the one event that we had Senate leadership, House leadership, and the governor all together. I personally heard a lot of common ground, as well as some differences, and that gave me hope. So if you are following, if you're following Frankfurt at all, you know that the pressing issue at hand is the budget, and the budget. And today we want to talk about the budget. Jessie has reminded me that just for a moment, I need to remind folks about the process. I would defer to our guest that when I get this wrong, their opening comment can be to correct me. But had I done this last year, I would have talked about a process that began with the governor presenting a budget, the House then massaging that budget, passing it, going to the Senate. The Senate does their thing, and then the House and Senate come together for a conference committee, really a budget committee, work out those differences, pass a unified budget, and send it to the governor. This year, that changed. So I think I probably was one of many Kentuckians who just had a wrong impression that I thought that was the process. This year, we learned that that was tradition, not necessarily formal protocol, because the House passed their budget before the governor presented his budget. I think, again, I would certainly defer to Ashli, Jim, and Jason if they don't agree with this, but in terms of the process that I am guessing plays out, is the House has passed their budget, I think last Friday. The Senate is working on modifications. They're going to come together and pass a legislative budget that will go to the governor. I'm going to be surprised if the governor does not veto, and I don't know if it's all or parts thereof. And then that probably is going to be overridden, and the legislative budget will become the law. So that's sort of just where we sit. What I want to do is emphasize to you, as partners, and I'm sure our guest will do the same, there is still time for you to influence deliberations. I mean, that's the heart of democracy, is that if you hear Jason or Ashli or Jim today say something that you agree with or that you really disagree with, all of you have a representative and all of you have a senator. Now is when you need to let them know what your priority is, whether that's K-12 or early childhood or child welfare or juvenile justice or something outside the realm of kids and families. So I want you to know that we don't see today as an academic exercise. We see it as a way to provide you with important information and important perspectives so you can make your voice heard. We have very deliberately invited three folks whom I deeply respect and who, frankly, disagree with one another on lots of governing issues and budget issues. And I think that's important because we respect you as partners so much that I want you to hear divergent views. The last thing I want to do, we at KYA certainly have a view on budget. We have issued a statement, which I'm sure each of you have read many times and memorized, but that's not the whole picture. I get it. So you're going to hear from three folks who I greatly respect, both their brains and their hearts. I just need to say that. We have Jason Bailey, who runs the Kentucky Center for Economic Policy, Ashli Watts, who is the CEO of the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce, and Jim Waters, who heads up the Bluegrass Policy Institute. Again, you're going to hear different perspectives on the same topic. So Ashli, Jim, and Jason, first of all, I know all of you guys are really busy, and it means a lot to us that you're taking time to join us today. I appreciate that. I want to open with what I don't think is being discussed enough, which is just quietly what I hear in Frankfurt is after we pass the budget, we then are going to do tax reform. Now, I have to say, and I've said this to legislators, they obviously don't agree with me. I guess I wish we would have tackled tax reform before we would have done the budget or done it in tandem, because the second part of that discussion, tax reform, is going to tell us what kind of revenue we have. So I don't totally get that. That's not being critical. I'm just being authentic. But I do think, and I just want to make sure that we have a little bit of time, because I personally think that part two of the fiscal discussion, how we're going to change our tax code, could be more profound and potentially more contentious than even the budget. So I think that folks on this call, they represent a spectrum. So I'm going to start with who I think may be a little bit in the middle here. So Ms. Watts, I'm going to begin with you. When you hear folks on both sides of the aisle and in both chambers just kind of mention, oh, and by the way, we're going to fundamentally alter the tax structure, what concerns you? What's your hope? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, thank you, Terry, and thank you to everyone at KYA for having me today. And I think you said sometimes Jim and Jason and I disagree, but it's always civil discourse, which I think is a lost art these days. And so I consider these two gentlemen friends of mine. We appear together quite frequently, and it's always good to kind of bounce these ideas back and forth. We're really excited at the Chamber that tax reform really is, we think, the top priority this legislative session. And you can kind of go back and forth on whether the budget or tax reform should have gone first. It's almost a little bit of chicken and egg, but we're just happy that the process has started and that discussions are ongoing. Back about early summer, our board of directors met and really did our 3-year strategic plan here at the Kentucky Chamber. And our board is made up of the top business leaders across Kentucky. And they decided that our top strategic priority for the next several years was really tax reform. And you can look around Kentucky the last, several months, and you see big investments like Ford and Toyota and other economic development announcements that are really exciting, but there's still more work to be done. And we took a look at the latest census, which I'm sure you guys have all looked at in the last couple of months, and we really saw that states that grew and states that didn't, and kind of we didn't have to reinvent the wheel. And I think we kind of know the steps that we need to take with tax reform to grow into the state that we know we can be. And so we're really excited to be working with the General Assembly on tax reform this session. Quickly mentioning the budget, I think, budgets are always easier when you have money, right? So this budget was probably a fairly easier budget to craft than other budgets in the past. And even Democrats who in the House, several did vote against it. They even said, this is a good budget. They feel like there could have been more investment, but it was a good budget. It's funded education at higher levels than have ever been. It funded our unemployment insurance system, which for our businesses was really key priority. And so now the Senate will have their turn to kind of see how they want to craft their budget. I do expect that it will go into a conference committee, because even though the Senate and the House are of the same political party, they have their own ideas of what should be in that budget and their own priorities. So I still kind of expect that same process, but they wanted to the House wanted to clear the way and kind of get the budget, which sometimes is the elephant in the room during these long sessions, get that done quickly. They knew their priorities they wanted to fund. They've been working on it all interim, so they could really focus on tax reform. And so the main thing I think that we're talking about when we talk about tax reform is really lowering that income tax. We see that the states in the last census that grew had lower income taxes or no income tax, and Kentucky right now is sitting at 5%. So there are several things like that the Chamber is going to be advocating for when it comes to tax reform, that we think that we can grow the population, increase businesses and economic development, and also, frankly, put more money in people's paychecks. I often say, if you live on the border here in Kentucky and you live in Tennessee, but rather than Kentucky, you've basically given yourselves a 5% raise when it comes to how much money you're taking home in your paycheck. Now, of course, taxes all kind of shake out. Those states tend to have higher consumption-based taxes, sales-based taxes. So that will all be part of the process as we move forward in this session. But I do think tax reform is a top priority this legislative session. And we from the Kentucky Chamber, we've partnered with the Tax Foundation and other groups the last couple of months to really ensure that it is a top priority. And so we are optimistic that some positive changes will be made.
So, Jason, what would the Jason Bailey tax reform package look like?
Well, Terry, if we really wanted to design a tax system that would allow our economy to grow like the prosperous states are growing, if we want to look at what they have done in recent years, there's about 12 states that have increased millionaires' taxes. So they have increased income taxes on the people at the top, not cut them. They've increased them. They closed corporate tax loopholes. They have, reduced just the number of tax breaks that are in their code. And they take that money and they pour it into investments in education, in healthcare, in infrastructure. They make a good quality of life and better economic well-being, reduce poverty, and that helps their economies to thrive. So that's the formula that we see all across the country that is actually working. I find it funny that we hear these conversations like, that people, the tax systems that are less reliant on income taxes are the ones that are growing or are the best economies. But if you look at what you're talking about, Tennessee is one of the poorest states in the country. Wyoming has 500,000 people. We have 4 million people in Kentucky. California, which is, I'm told, has a terrible tax system, has 40 million people. And the only reason people are leaving California is that the economy is so strong that housing prices are not affordable anymore. And so people have to leave. So, there's a lot of risk. We have, in this state, since 2008, made pretty dramatic cuts to our core services that we need as a state. And this budget, the House budget that we saw, it only makes modest increases in funding, and only in certain areas, and doesn't begin to make up for the ground that we lost. If you look at that House budget and you look at how much we're putting into our core funding formula for our K-12 schools, it's $50 million less than we put in 16 years ago. $50 million less than 16 years ago. That's a 30% cut after you take into account inflation. So this idea that we're funding schools at a record level, it's just false. And the areas of the state that are hurt the most, and the people that are hurt the most when we underinvest in our budget, are the rural areas, they're people of color, and they're low-income people. And those are also the folks who will see their taxes go up when we shift away from income taxes, because disproportionately the beneficiaries of those are the wealthy and the powerful. The top 5% would get about 38% of an income tax cut. It would go to them. They're not putting that money back into the Kentucky economy. They're going to save it. They're going to squirrel it away in an investment account. They may be speculating on cryptocurrency in this environment. They're not putting that money back into our communities. But if we give teachers a raise, which this budget doesn't do, if we invest in improving people's health, in hiring more nurses, in modernizing our infrastructure, those dollars circulate in our economy, improve our quality of life, and we'll make it for a better state. So that's the path we should be going on. I have a lot of concern about the kind of tax package that we may see, that's not only going to squander this surplus that we have now, but will permanently damage our ability to make the investments that thriving states make.
Let me ask you just one quick follow-up, Jason, because we have some, just looking at the screen, we have some academicians on here who like to do their own research. We've heard Tennessee as an exemplar, given one concept of the budget. Is there a state that you believe is, if you could push a button, Kentucky would most emulate? I'm not trying to box you in, but I'm just wondering if you could offer up, if somebody wanted to do some independent looking. So here's Tennessee's tax. Is there a state you would direct people to?
Well, I think it varies, but you could look at what has happened in, for example, two states that are right next to each other, Minnesota and Wisconsin. They took dramatically different directions in terms of their tax system. Wisconsin cut their income taxes, cut their corporate taxes. Minnesota did the exact opposite. They raised taxes on the people at the top, and look at how they've done. They've outperformed Wisconsin in every measure. And it's because we know that investments in schools, investments in quality of life, investments in infrastructure are the things that help states prosper.
Okay, great. Jim, we mentioned at the beginning that we wanted folks to hear divergent thinking. I'm just going to take a wild hypothesis that your thinking on tax structure might be somewhat different than Jason's. So I want to give you a little time to riff. What would be the Jim Waters tax package?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Terry. And I want to thank you as well and Kentucky Youth Advocates for hosting this event today, for inviting me to be a part of this. And it's great to discuss and debate these issues. I want to commend the lawmakers. The primary constitutional responsibility of lawmakers is to pass the budget. And you're absolutely right. It's been a tradition for the governor to propose a budget, but at the end of the day, it's the lawmaker's responsibility. And I think this is the best process that we've seen that I can remember since we started the Bluegrass Institute 18 years ago. This is certainly the earliest they've gotten a budget done that in my memory. And, this is going to allow time not only to discuss tax reform, but also to actually for all the members of the General Assembly to actually look at this budget, and for stakeholders, for all of you all on this call and all of us to really have a real vigorous debate and discussion about this. And so I want to commend them for getting this work done. We have a lot of surplus money. We have the money that's coming in May from Washington on COVID dollars. There's going to be a lot of money that can be spent. But let's keep in mind that a lot of that's going to be one-time dollars. And so I want to commend the legislature as well for creating a strong rainy day fund. One of the consistent elements in states that are doing well economically, doing better than Kentucky, growing faster, and expanding their economies has been a strong rainy day fund. So if there's a COVID that hits, if there's a downturn in the economy, then they have the resources to not have to piecemeal a tax increase or take spending from other essential government services. When it comes to tax reform, we have three basic principles that we would like to see in tax reform. One is, are the changes revenue neutral? In any tax package? What we're concerned about the most is the overall burden on taxpayers. So whether we're talking about a sales tax or income tax or whatever, I think the first principle is that it needs to be revenue neutral and won't increase that overall burden. And we do believe, and Ashli, I totally agree, I think moving more toward tax policy that relies more on consumption taxes rather than taxing income and savings and retirement is also another key principle. When you tax income, whether it's corporate or personal, you're actually discouraging productivity. You're actually punishing productivity. The more productive a person is, or the more productive a business is, the more they're really it's punitive and discourages that. A consumption-based tax, and it can be done in the right way, protecting low-income residents from suffering because of that. I think it can be done the right way. Other states have shown it can be done. And then the third principle is, do the tax changes favor individuals and entrepreneurs over narrow special interests? So, we want to see this happen. And I have to take issue with some of the things that Jason said in terms of other states. I mean, if you look at population growth between 2010 and 2020, Tennessee, for example, experienced nearly a 9% population growth. North Carolina, a state that Kentucky competes against for economic growth and projects, they have grown by nearly 10% the last decade, and they have been lowering their income taxes. Indiana, our neighbor, is talking about another reduction in both their individual and their business income taxes. So, I just would say I've never had a broke person give me a job. I don't think anybody's ever had somebody who's broke give them a job. So I don't think we need to be punishing job creators and discouraging entrepreneurship and discouraging growth. And the states that are growing and prospering are the states who are allowing people to make their own decisions about their dollars and not taking so many of them away. So I think those are some principles that have worked well in states. When you look at Kentucky's overall tax burden right now, we're 21st nationally in overall tax burden compared to North Carolina, which is 33rd, Indiana, which is 35th, and Tennessee, which is 48th. And our tax policy looks more like states like New York and New Jersey and California and Illinois than it does states that are that we consider to be growing and prospering. So I think that that's important. And also, I would also say that I want to commend the lawmakers as well for giving raises to our state employees. There's a 6% increase in here for state employees who haven't had a raise. State troopers are going to get a raise. And it's not true that teachers aren't going to get a raise. That's a misnomer about this budget. What the lawmakers did was something even better. They allow local districts now to make these decisions about whether teachers are going to get raises, and they're increasing funding to local school districts, and they're going to allow superintendents to make decisions based on what works best in their district. So I think that's a much better way than Frankfurt, forcing a one-size-fits-all pay increase. And maybe it helps and maybe it doesn't help some districts, but I think that's important. And, when we talk about increases to state employees, we also need to make sure, the lawmakers need to make sure that that they take into account the increase in benefit costs, because when you increase the pay, you need to also make sure that the increase in pension benefits, which would apply especially to people under the old tiers and the older systems, that those benefits are properly pre-funded. Because one of the reasons we have such a huge unfunded liability in our pension system right now is because in the past, those considerations were not given when raises were handed out or increases. So we need to make sure responsibly that we're doing that. So, I think there's a lot to like about the legislators' budget. I think they've done a pretty good job here.
Okay, great. Not panelists, but participants, just want to emphasize, and our panelists are doing exactly what we want them to do. Our premise on this is that we really want to give participants time to go deep. There's a lot of forums where folks get 30-second sound bites. So what we're going to do is really look at 3 or 4 issues in depth. We're not going to try to cover 100 issues in 55 minutes. I think one of the overarching discussion points for this budget is unprecedented federal dollars. In KYA's statement, I think we opened, I don't have it in front of me, but I think we opened by saying we're used to arguing about scarce resources. What we've learned is even plentiful resources can be argued over. So, I think there, again, for our partners, when I look at the unprecedented money that is coming down, it seems as if it falls into essentially two buckets. That's a very technical phrase, but there is a categorical bucket. So, for instance, for infrastructure, I don't hear a huge amount of dissent on whether we're going to deal with bridges and highways and airports. So that's big bucks, but just understand that that's limited. You can't use highway money for social workers, okay? It seems as if the dissent and different perspectives comes with what could be called discretionary dollars, where we as a state have to decide where to invest them. And again, from my perspective, the key rubric that people see differently is what do you do about one-time money? How do you use non-recurring revenue? Some folks, I think, want to address in a significant way what are clearly on the cusp crises, emerging issues. We need to deal with this. Other folks, as has been mentioned, I think worry about what if we make an investment now, what happens in 2 years? So I'm interested, before we get into giving a grade on to the governor or to the House's budget, I'm interested in our panelist philosophies, because if they were lawmakers, I think the first thing they have to figure out is what should they do? What should we do with this unprecedented money? So, Jason, why don't I start with you? And again, you can add to or subtract from how I framed it. But I think that's a core discussion point, is with these bonus bucks, what should they be used for?
Yeah. Well, and I think it's important to understand that there is both one-time and recurring monies. So we had surpluses. We're having surpluses, which means we're bringing in more than we thought we would bring in, and that increase is continuing over the next couple of years. So we have billions of dollars in both categories to work with. So obviously, with one-time money, let's take the American Rescue Plan Act money, which is specifically federal money that has come, and what's called the State Fiscal Recovery Fund, which is very flexible, as you were sort of talking about. That is intended to be a rescue plan. It's intended to help those who were hurt the most by COVID. And there are several categories of things that they can be used for. But the deepest needs that remain is that the people who were hurt the hardest by this pandemic are people who were already vulnerable coming into the pandemic, low-income people, people who work low-wage jobs. That's disproportionately who was laid off when we lost the 300,000 jobs at the worst point in this pandemic. We haven't gained all those jobs back yet, although the economy has been growing, expanding. We have not gained all those jobs back, and folks are still struggling. So the highest and best priority of that one-time rescue plan money should be to provide relief in the form of cash assistance, food assistance, housing assistance to those who are hurt the most. I haven't seen that in the priorities. If you look at the House budget and combine it with what was passed last year, the biggest appropriation of that money, $800 million, is to cut business taxes. It's to go into the unemployment fund, which it has the result of lowering business taxes. The biggest beneficiary of that would be a huge employer like Amazon, who has seen record profits. They will get a huge windfall from taxes that would slowly and very modestly go up anyway to replenish that fund. So I don't think that's the best use of that money at all. In terms of other one-time money, I think there are long-standing infrastructure needs that we have all across the Commonwealth. I think there's general agreement, as you maybe indicated, Terry, that across the aisle that those sort of things need to happen, and a lot of them are in the House budget. But when it comes to the recurring expenses, I would say two things. One is that we have a lot of ground to make up. We've had 20 rounds of budget cuts. We have a crisis in retaining employees in public employment, in teachers, in school employees, bus drivers, because we're not paying them enough. We haven't given state employees raises in 10 of the last 12 years. And I appreciate that there's at least a 1 year of a raise in this budget for state employees. There's not a raise for teachers in this budget, and there's not enough money sent to school districts for them, many of them, to provide a raise. The amounts in education are too small The House is putting $1 billion less into K-12 education than what the governor proposed for a raise to be affordable. And we know we have a teacher shortage, and it's just going to get worse. So we need to reinvest in the core functions of government, make sure we have the employees to do the job. There are about 7,000 open positions in state government because we're not providing them. We're not paying them enough. And then we need to take the opportunity, because there is enough money here, to chart some new territory and do things that we've known all along we need to do. And I would take early childhood education as probably at the top of that list. Preschool, childcare, improving the availability and the quality and the affordability of those things has got to be at the top of our list. But at least in the House budget, as passed, there's not a dime more in those things. And I know there's some conversation about potentially a follow-up bill. I sure hope that comes, because I can't imagine leaving $1.1 billion sideline, which is what's left, unspent in this House budget, and not putting a dime more to early childhood education. It seems like a real missed opportunity.
Jim, you either were ESP, my next question. You showed some of your thoughts, I think, on this question in your initial answer. But so we have more dollars than we typically have. Jason made a great point. Some of that is from just increased prosperity, but others are that one-time money. What should be the guiding principles for our General Assembly in terms of what they do with more resources than they're used to having?
Well, that two things on that. One is, it would be good just to think for a moment about why we have some increased prosperity here. I think some of the past decisions made by the legislature in the past few budgets, they have been very fiscally conservative, and they've been very careful. And because of that, our situation in Kentucky is better than it could have been, considering COVID and all that. So, it's the surpluses we have in our budget are because of some of those good financial decisions made in the past. And so that's one point. Another is, I haven't heard from my friend Jason Bailey anything about saving for the future. And I know that the responsible thing for families to do, and if we care about improving Kentucky's economic standing and fiscal standing for future generations, I would think that that would be at the top of the list, that we don't need to consider unspent dollars right now as burning a hole in our pocket. I think what we need to do is, the responsible thing is to hold on to some of that money. And I think I've heard the legislative leaders talk about there may be needs in the future, such as some additional infrastructure needs or other funding that they want to do that will maybe, if we get a good tax reform approach, those surplus dollars could provide a cushion, because a lot of the discussion is always about what a tax change is going to cost. Well, if we could buffer that or provide a gap in that, or cover that gap or fill that gap, I think that would be something worth looking at as well, but I think it's important that we have a strong rainy day fund, and the legislators have done that, and that we have a process in place whereby we keep it strong, so that if there is a downturn in the economy, if there is another COVID, we're in a much better position, like the states we compete with, to absorb that without hurting our key government funding for key government services. I think that's important.
Ashli, what about it? The rubric that the chamber believes should be used for this unprecedented available revenue?
Well, I think we need to think about also that the federal money has done exactly what it was supposed to do. It stimulated the economy. People had money. That's why sales receipts are up. People have spent more money. Local governments are still figuring out how they're going to spend all their money, as are school districts. And so it did exactly what we had hoped it would do, which is really stimulate the economy. But that time is now up. I don't think there will be any more stimulus coming from the federal government. And so I do think it's really important. I think from a business community perspective, we have to be fiscally responsible with this kind of one-time, once-in-a-lifetime money, to know that you just have to turn on the news or go buy any kind of groceries that you would buy at your Kroger store to see that inflation has gone through the roof. And so something is going to happen with the economy that we are going to need some sort of rainy day fund. Now, we have one, of course, and maybe the Senate may not agree quite with the same amount the House has put into this fund, but I do think it's fiscally responsible. And I think Kentuckians want their tax dollars to go for the services of which they should: education and healthcare, those kind of things that this budget is funded. But I also think they want that the legislature to be responsible with their money, that if the economy does take a downturn, or God forbid there's another pandemic or something should happen in the future, there will be some money set aside so that you're not going to have benefits cut, salaries cut, tax increases, et cetera. So I think it's really a balance. I think it is a good opportunity to fund things that maybe had not been able to be funded fully before, and maybe even look at new streams of funding as well. I don't disagree with Jason at all about early childhood education. We at the chamber feel like that is vitally important, and we're hopefully, in the rest of the session, going to work on something to really address that. But I do think we have to be fiscally responsible with this money, knowing that the economy may not always be as it is right now. And I think this budget has done a really good job at kind of balancing everything that is needed right now and funding those, but also putting some aside for a rainy day.
Okay. So we could spend 3 hours if I were to cover all the kids sectors that I'd like to cover with you all. But since 2 of the 3 of you have nominated a deeper discussion on early childhood, let's go there for a minute. The good news is I think there's a growing awareness how important early childhood experiences are. That's the good news. The bad news is everybody has sort of a different perspective. And I have to tell you, I'm a little worried that we'll have a fragmented effort where we do a little on a lot and maybe nothing really well. That's just me. I'm pleased to know that there appears to be a consensus, for instance, with the governor, the House, and the Senate, I believe we'll see, for full day kindergarten, because that was a concern. So if I'm a superintendent or a mom or dad, I'm kind of relieved that that really has now become part of the K-12 system. But let's probe a little bit. I've let you guys sort of be at the meta narrative level. Let's get a little more detailed. And I'd like you to think just a little bit about a more detailed view of what you think should be in the early childhood section, whether that's universal pre-K or childcare, how we can bring that to fruition. Jim, why don't I open with you from the Bluegrass perspective? You guys are all over the whole idea of learning. How do you see that birth to kindergarten period of time? How would you like to see that supported? What's your vision for that piece of a kid's development?
Well, I think it's important that we entrust parents and give as many options as we can, for that, just like we should for all levels of education. I'd like to see maybe encouraging, different kinds of opportunities for parents with that age group. There's increasing amount of research that it is very important, and especially in the early part of a child's education experience. So, but I think the more that, I think it's one thing for government, for example, to say we need to have access to early childhood education or any other education for that matter. I think it's not necessarily government's role to deliver all of that. I think if we can come up with some I'd like to see a little more creative approaches to this, where we encourage, maybe faith-based organizations in some of our inner city areas, help them with some resources. They're very good at knowing what their communities need. So I'd like to see us be a little more, thinking a little more in those terms, and seeing how we can actually really help groups that are good at this and can do it well. So, that would be one thought I think I would add to the discussion.
Okay. So, Ashli, we saw that during the middle of the pandemic, Senator Schumer and Senator McConnell were totally in sync on early childhood. I think we saw that as Build Back Better emerged, early childhood became partisan and polarizing. We know that half the kids in Kentucky show up to kindergarten not prepared. From the Chamber's perspective, what should we be doing to support kids and families from birth to that kindergarten entry point?
The Chamber is a very strong supporter of early childhood education, and we always have been. And I can speak as a mother of a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old, and my 6-year-old was in preschool when the pandemic happened. And I can assure you, virtual preschool is not the same as being in person and kind of that hands-on learning that my daughter was able to experience. And so I think this conversation is interesting because it is a lot of one-time money in the budget right now. And so you don't want to fund programs and then a couple years down the road not have the money to fund them. So I think all-day kindergarten is a great start. I think from the Chamber's perspective, we're also looking at some other ways for early childhood education, whether that comes in kind of incentivizing businesses to offer those benefits for their employees, which is something that a lot of businesses are doing right now. But we know, and you guys can speak to it a lot better than I can from KYA's perspective, but a child's brain develops faster in those early childhood years than any other period of their life. And so what we've learned is that when we look at states that have really invested in early childhood education, it is an investment. It does take money on the front end, but years down the road, there are less Medicaid dollars. There are less money going to corrections because you have that really strong foundation of a child being ready to start kindergarten, being ready to start school. Their third grade reading levels are better. And so it really is an investment that in everywhere where it has been done has proven to be exceedingly beneficial. And so we're strong supporters of early childhood. And on another kind of part of this too, where it's a win-win, is that it's also a workforce solution as well. Right now, you all know Kentucky is in a workforce crisis. We have the third lowest workforce participation rate in the entire United States. And I think any of us that have had to work full-time, go to school with children full-time, daycares being closed. I just got the notice my kids are going to be NTI the next 2 days. It really has impacted women in the workforce to a substantial degree. And so not only is it good for the child and for the child's learning and development, it's also really good for our workforce, in particular women in the workforce.
Jason, you already raised it on your own, which I appreciate. So not that you did this, but not just saying, hey, early childhood needs it. Are there discrete elements that you hope we see in the budget?
Well, I mean, I think we got to recognize that we both have resources and we're in a situation where especially the childcare sector has been really devastated. We've lost about half of our childcare centers that we've had since 2012 because of budget cuts and lack of affordability. I mean, the market is broken for childcare. People can't afford it because they don't make enough money. The pay is so low that the turnover is very high. They can't keep and retain workers in the childcare industry, and that affects the quality of the care, obviously, in addition to the availability that's there. So I think that what I would love to see is us get on a path of building toward greater availability and quality with clear goals in mind over a period of years. It's going to take a little while. Realistically, it's going to be a mixed delivery model. It's going to include private childcare as well as public preschool. We know that just the hours that parents need childcare doesn't necessarily correspond to the school hours. And we already have an infrastructure to some degree in the private childcare industry. So it needs to be a both and solution where folks are working together. But we're going to have to increase the subsidies directly to that care, to increase the wages, to increase the professionalization of childcare and early and preschool, to expand the physical capacity, actual locations that are safe and accessible to provide childcare. And I'd love to see over a plan over 5 years, over 10 years, to expand the number of slots. Build Back Better is not going to pass, but I will say that West Virginia has been a model for this, and that was done by Governor Joe Manchin.
It's a mixed delivery model, right?
That's right, mixed delivery. And so I still think there's a chance that the preschool and childcare portion of Build Back Better perhaps does pass Congress. And if so, that's essentially what it did. And states have to put in a little bit of money, but federal government will pay for most of it. And, if that bill passed, if that portion passed, we would have universal preschool for 3 and 4-year-olds. And no parent would pay more than 7% of their income for childcare. Many would pay nothing. That would be life-changing for our economy, for kids, for parents' availability to work and balance their family life as well. And I sure hope it passes, and I hope if it does, Kentucky participates.
Okay, great. So I want to, again, our approach on forums like this is to let panelists, because you don't get invited randomly, so we respect all of your perspectives. I want to give you time to sort of do a riff for the benediction of this. And I'd like you to frame it a little bit that where we sit right now, again, without being redundant, we know that the budget the House passed is going to be the foundation for what ultimately becomes the budget. The Senate is in the middle of cussing and discussing that budget, and then they'll all come together and send it to the governor. Where you sit right now, when you think about Kentucky's kids, because I've let you all be broad so far, so if it's a KYA forum, I got to land the plane on kid and family issues. What are the couple things that are most on your brain right now? What do you think that our participants should be paying most attention to, whether it's tax reform, budget specifics? Give them some homework. Give them some things to follow as this process plays out. So, Ashli, you want to open with the Ashli Watts benediction comment?
Oh, we'll see. We'll see how the collection plate goes after I'm done with this. I made some notes because I did want to highlight a couple of key education bills that from the chamber perspective are really important. They're not new bills. They've been around a couple of years, but they are making their way through the legislative process. I think we'll start off obviously with funding in the budget. The chamber for many years has been a strong supporter of increasing the education funding in the budget. We just have to look at our baccalaureate attainment here in Kentucky that has dropped over the last decade and see that it directly correlates with less money being funded toward education. And so that's important that money stays in the budget. We're also looking at some bills that have passed committee that are now on the House side, going onto the floor, and one on the Senate side, one dealing with third grade reading levels that we've worked very closely on the last couple of years with Representative Tipton and Senator West. And so I think that we have had some compromise on that bill to really make sure that our students are reading at the level they need to be. Another one expands dual credit, and that was a bill by Representative Tipton. I think it passed out of committee yesterday that would expand dual credit and the high school students that would qualify for that. Another one is a bill that would talk about our Key Scholarship. Key Scholarships have been around. I got a couple years of Key Scholarships back when I was in high school, so a little over 20 years, but really kind of looking at targeting that to where our workforce needs and maybe having those Key Scholarships be applicable to trade schools as well as just the traditional kind of college route, which we think is really important for our workforce. And then one of the bills that we've really championed the last couple of years is that everyone graduating from high school here in Kentucky should have to fill out the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid, because we know here in Kentucky, we leave so much federal money on the table. And sometimes children and high school students just don't know they're eligible for it. They think that college or some sort of post-secondary education is kind of a dream they may not be able to achieve because financially their family just may not be able to afford it. But if they filled out the FAFSA and saw the money that could be on the table for them, that may give them the path to higher education they didn't know they had. So we would like to have that be a graduation requirement as well. And that bill is passed out of committee as well. So we have some positive momentum at the beginning of session, really looking at how we can kind of further those educational requirements to prepare our future workforce.
Okay, great. And Ashli, I'll say instead of you, so I'm sure if you were using keys 20 years ago, I did not know that you graduated high school at the age of 8. So yeah.
I was a child phenom, as you can probably tell.
That's great. That's great. Jim, what about it as you think in a big, broad way, your closing hopes and reflections for our participants today?
Yeah, well, I did want to also say, and this is, we'll get to the question here, but one of the other good things I think from this budget overall is that we have quit sweeping money out of funds. For example, dollars have not been swept out of the transportation budget to be used for non-infrastructure projects, which we think is going to be very helpful in meeting the needs of building and repairing roads and bridges. Also, the lottery money is no longer being swept out there. Those dollars are being used for educational purposes and needs. At the Bluegrass Institute, one of our primary policy objectives is to bring more options and more choices, more opportunities for parents. And I think, I hope during this session, we will see some more of those options. We would like to see charter schools in Kentucky fully funded. We have a charter school law, but there's no funding for that. So this is also a great opportunity to put a funding mechanism in place for these public schools. They're public schools, which are schools of choice. Parents decide to send children there, and which are managed a little differently than the traditional public schools, but are having some great success around the country in closing achievement gaps between poor and wealthier students, and helping our kids and giving kids who would fall through the cracks of our system opportunities to turn that around and to have a great education as well. So I think that's something we definitely would like to see happen, and also just more opportunities in general, I think, for parents. So that's major emphasis of ours.
Okay, Jason, you get the final word of the final word here, my friend.
Great, thanks, Terry, and appreciate KYA for having me, and as well as my panelists for joining me today. I think that if you care about kids and families, there's gotta be money for stuff. And so I think a lot of folks know more about the spending side than they do the tax side. This budget in this session is going to be a real inflection point for our budget far into the future. There's so much extra money available at this time that I think the budget that will pass will make some improvements in funding. I think they'll be modest. I think the Senate will come up with something that's more modest than the House did, and probably will end up in the middle. But the decision that's going to be made about the taxes is going to affect Kentucky potentially permanently. And not only are there big pushes like attempts to cut the income tax, which is 40% of our revenue comes from the income tax. And when you cut it, the benefits of that disproportionately go to the people at the top. But not only that, because there's so much money available, there are just swarms of, frankly, special interest lobbyists looking for special tax cuts for their industry or their group. We saw that last session when there were tax cuts for cryptocurrency mining, for Hollywood movie producers, for hotel developers. That's going to be increased many times over in this session. So there's the real potential to squander and give away not only what we have for this one-time money, but permanently hinder our ability to invest in education, healthcare, and infrastructure far into the future. So I would just encourage folks to pay attention to that side of the ledger. Learn a little more about what those proposals are and what the impact would be, who pays more and who pays less when there are drastic changes to our tax system, because that's going to affect our ability to support kids, not just in this budget, but far into the future.
Thank you so much. Ashli, Jim, Jason, thank you so much. Thank you, partners, for joining us. I do want to emphasize that y'all know I'm terrible at technology, so I don't know how this happens, but I know that in the follow-up, we will link you to Jason, Ashli, and Jim's organizational websites. At best, this is an appetizer. So we really want you to delve in. And again, I want to encourage you. You saw thoughtful, divergent discussion today, and I really appreciate the tonality that we saw today. So dig in. If you heard Jason say something that you really agree with or really disagree with, dig in and learn more about where he is or where Ashli is or where Jim is. And so we'll include that. If you haven't done it, I do hope that you'll pay attention to our own budget statement. I personally like a notion of venture investment that we're proposing around tax reform. Let's give it a try while we got some safety nets to do it, but dig into that and check us out and let us know where you agree and where you disagree with us. So wrapping it up today is Mehek Kalra. Mehek, I know you've already said that you think the additional money should be used to help a certain university buy out their basketball coach and make the right hire. That's your idea, and Larry Mihalacek, who I see on this call. So I don't know if you want to talk about that or if you're going to talk about something else, but I think you're going to close us out today.
Thanks, Terry. I'm sure everyone wants to hear about U of L's new basketball coach and what happens next. But just going back to the conversation that we had today, we really appreciate our panelists for joining us today, discussing how kids and families could be affected by the proposed budget, tax reform, and creative approaches to early childhood education. We also want to thank Aetna Better Health of Kentucky for their support of today's Advocate Virtual Forum. And as the state budget discussions continue in the next coming weeks, Kentucky Youth Advocates will continue to assess and monitor budget proposals throughout the process. It's really important for your advocacy for kids throughout this legislative session. So don't forget to check out our 2022 Blueprint for Kentucky's Children policy agenda. Also review the bill tracker for status on bills that are good for kids this session, and share your policy priorities that are important to you with your state senator and representative. Also, don't forget to monitor our social media pages. We update them regularly with information, including what day it is in this legislative session if you've forgotten. As always, the follow-up email will include a recording of today's forum and any links that we discussed. Thanks again for joining, and we'll talk to you soon.